Okay, so let me begin today's webinar. My name is Olesa Khromochuk. I'm the director of the Ukrainian Institute London, and we're an independent charity that champions Ukrainian culture and shapes the conversation about Ukraine in the UK and beyond. We engage experts, creatives, policymakers, and active citizens to explore Ukrainian perspectives on global challenges. And with our diverse program of public-facing events, educational courses, and digital content, we enable audiences around the world to access nuanced and reliable information about Ukraine. The UIL is an independent charity registered in England and Wales, and we rely on donations of our supporters, and therefore are very grateful to everybody who's able to support our work. Today, we are marking a very sad anniversary. We're marking an anniversary, a deportation day, anniversary of the deportation of Crimean Tatars. And that is what we'll be discussing today. It's a historically tragic anniversary, but it has become even more tragic since Russia's occupation of Crimea in 2014 and in the process of the ongoing genocidal war that Russia is waging against Ukraine. Today, we'll be talking about these tragic historical experiences of deportation, but we'll also talk about the experiences of return in the 1990s of the Crimean Tatars to Crimea, but also hopefully discuss the possibilities for the return of Crimea after it is deoccupied, something that we're all waiting for with great anticipation. And I am delighted to introduce our speakers for tonight's webinar. I'll begin with the speaker and the curator of today's discussion, Emine Ziyatdinova, who's a Crimean Tatar documentary photographer, researcher, and independent consultant, currently working in nonprofit and media development sphere. Emine was born in Uzbekistan, where her family was deported from Crimea in 1944 by the Stalin regime. Growing up as a member of the Crimean Tatar minority in Ukraine after the Soviet Union's collapse, she received a first-hand understanding of the various human rights issues that arose with ethnic minorities and within the collapse of the economic and political system in Ukraine. The desire to advocate for people who are often silenced, to voice their concerns, brought her to the career paths of sociology and documentary photography. And having worked in documentary photography and journalism from 2012 until 2017 in Ukraine, she relocated to the UK, where she has been working in the non-profit sector, mostly as a media consultant with the Reuters Foundation. Emine's work has been supported by a Fulbright Scholarship and a Magnum Foundation Emergency Fund Fellowship, and her photography projects have been exhibited in Ukraine as well as internationally, and really hope to hear more about her work throughout the evening today. We will also be joined, I believe she's not here yet, she's based in Kyiv. She is. Fantastic. Yeah, so in any case, we're joined by another wonderful speaker, Lily Hyde, who's a British writer and journalist based in Ukraine and is currently joining us from Kyiv. Her novel Dreamland, based on first-hand testimony and interviews, is about the return of the Crimean Tatars to Crimea in the 1990s. Published in 2008, it has been translated into Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar, and she is currently completing a book about Crimea since Russia's occupation. She has written for Politico, The Guardian, The Times, and many, many other outlets. So we're in extremely safe hands. I would just like to point out that the discussion is being recorded and we will share it on our YouTube channel. And also there will be an opportunity for those of you who wish to ask a question, to ask your question both through chat and also with live video on if you wish to do so at the end of the webinar. Emine, thank you so much for making this discussion happen for us. Over to you.
Thank you, Olesa, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight to commemorate 79th anniversary of Surgun in Crimean Tatar, which stands for Deportation of Crimean Tatars. As Olesa said, the entire Crimean Tatar nation was deported in 2 days in 1944, May 18th and 19th. from Crimea to the Urals, Siberia, and Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan as well, to Central Asia. And as a result, 1/3 of population of Crimean Tatars vanished within several years after deportation and as a result of deportation. I'm myself Crimean Tatar, and I grew up in Crimea. And so for me, this is not just a subject of my work or my research, but it's for me, it's quite a personal story. The story, the family history, which pretty much shaped who I am and shaped where I am standing today as my career as well. And I was born in Uzbekistan in Lenina Collective Farm, which actually is the same place where my paternal grandmother was deported in 1944. And we returned to Crimea in 1990, a year after Soviet Union lifted a ban from Crimea, ban to Crimean Tatars to return to their homeland. I'll be myself and a colleague and friend, Ediye Kataman, will be reading some excerpts from interviews with my late grandmother today, her memories and recollections of events of deportation and first year in Uzbekistan today. I interviewed my late grandmother several times during several years before, and so it's like kind of edited version of it. But as we and we worked with Lily together before in Crimea, and I actually want to open today's presentation with a photograph of just a second. Actually, it's a selfie, myself and Lily. It's a photograph which we took in December 2016 as we were on reporting trip in Crimea. And it was quite a difficult trip because we went 2 or 3 times to Crimea, and we spent quite a lot of time with families of Crimean Tatar prisoners and arrested people who were arrested, and families of people who were kidnapped by FSB and disappeared in Crimea after annexation of Crimea in 2014. And I think, and we were quite exhausted, and that day it snowed and it was beautiful, and we were in Bakhchisarai, and we were like, okay, let's take a break and let's just go for hiking. And it was so, I would just want to say it was so beautiful, and it's like, and all these layers of history were just engraved in that landscape. We passed old Crimean Tatar Muslim cemetery of probably 15th or 16th century. And we passed an old Karaites settlement, like the ruins. Karaites is a Turkic-speaking Jewish ethnic group which is indigenous to Crimea. And we passed this Christian Orthodox monastery, which is still functioning there. It's under Russian Orthodox Church, actually. But I think looking at all these layers of history, which was like there, I think at the same time, it's like looking at it, it's quite rigid and tragic history when you look how all this ethnic composition changed in Crimea through the centuries, but also it gave hope in a way, because it's like nothing is permanent, right? So the powers changed over Crimea. So sort of like hope, okay, maybe Russia is not forever there. And the place itself, historically significant. So Bakhchisarai, which this photograph was taken around, is used to serve as the capital of Crimean Khanate, which was Crimean Tatar state under Ottoman Empire, which broke out from Golden Horde in 1441, mid 15th century, with Haji Giray, who was a Khan, and this Khanate, pretty much autonomic state, existed. It played significant role in European history and was significant power, which in the region. And so which existed until 1783, when Russian Empire annexed Crimea the first time. Russian Empire was led by Catherine II at the time. So by this first annexation in 1783, pretty much Russian Empire secured their southern border and kind of got like quite a good position for military in there, because there were like a lot of Russo-Ottoman Russo-Ottoman wars happening. So it was quite in good position to establish themselves, and it was very important for Russian Empire. And it's actually at that time, it was the first time when Tsars got these the proposals from their military about removal of Crimean Tatars from the area, as it was quite significant. And if you follow history, the 18th century, the Russo-Turkish or Russo-Ottoman wars continued, and Crimean Tatars as a Turkic-speaking Muslim community was seen as unloyal to Russian Empire element on the border. And Crimean Tatars at the time of first annexation were a majority in Crimea, and they made up 80 to 85% of population of Crimean Peninsula, And but with all the policies Russian Empire was putting in Crimea, including repressions and repression of Crimean Tatar nobility and oppressive rules for Crimean Tatars to develop, and also encouragement of immigration flows from Russia, from inland Russian Empire to the Crimea. We have and volunteer Crimean Tatar immigration to Ottoman Empire, especially after the Crimean War of 1853 to 56. Pretty much we have the situation when at the beginning of 20th century, Crimean Tatars population from 80 to 85% became 30, like minority, about 30 to 35% of population of Crimea. And on the time of deportation, which was 1944, Crimean Tatars made up about 20% of the population of Crimea. And it's also a lot of things happened like through 20th century and Soviet power arrival, and maybe I'll share another photograph with you of my family as well, and talk about this about my family and what happened to them. So this person is my great-grandfather, Emir Vili Abdul Kerim, whose properties actually were in late 20s collectivized, and he was arrested in 1937 and persecuted a couple months later as a part, accused of anti-government and anti-Soviet agitation among the collective farm workers. It was part of Stalin purges, and it touched quite a lot of Crimean Tatar intelligentsia in time, and a lot of and leadership of Crimean Tatars as well at the time. And then there is the older son, which is my grandmother brother, Shaib Emir Velioglu. He was mobilized to the Soviet army in 1941, and he was taken prisoner of war. And after the end of Second World War, he actually immigrated to Turkey. And my great-grandmother, Ajeriya Kurtveli kızı, she, with her younger son and my grandmother, who is not on the photograph there, she was not born yet because the photograph was taken 1929 or so, 1929 and 1930. They were forcefully deported in 1944 and lived through all the horror events of deportation. Actually, I want to ask my colleague and friend, Ediye Kataman, who is a Crimean Tatar a filmmaker and producer, to help me with reading excerpts from interviews with my grandmother and to describe the deportation itself. Wait, should I unmute you? Just a second.
Yeah, Ediye should be unmuted now.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Emine. Good evening, everyone. So I want to read a part of interview of Emine Ziyatdinova, who was born in 1932 in Eski Burna in Crimea and tragically deported in the age of 11. Auntie Gulsum gave birth, so my mom went to their house to help out. Back then, on the third day, the closest women relatives gathered to help out with bathing and cleaning. I was left at my uncle's house with my cousins. That night, 2 soldiers stayed over at our house. Everyone had soldiers staying over that night in their houses. Early in the morning, I ran back crying to our house. What happened? What happened? Did you hurt yourself? My mom asked, worried. No, we are being sent away. Auntie Nasib told me. They are putting on their new dresses. We are being expelled. The soldiers in our house were already standing there, urging us to hurry up and take only food with us. We got dressed and walked to the square between the mosque and the well, where some people had already gathered. We waited on that square until it got dark. Although the others couldn't leave, the kids were allowed to return home and take some belongings. Throughout the day, young Russian women and boys from neighboring village went from house to house, taking whatever they wanted. And what did I bring? Mom, look, I brought your golden jug. My mother worriedly replied, oh God, if this falls, it will break. Why did you bring this porcelain jug, my thoughtless child? It would be better if you brought the metal one where we can boil water. My brother, Emir Ahmed, who was 3 years older, brought some corn and flour. Late at night, they lowered us into the back of a small truck with 3 other families. It was dark and nobody could see anything or knew what was happening. I was crying, clutching my doll. My mom became irritated and snatched my doll, tossing it aside. Here is the Quran, she said, handing me the book. Hold onto it and nothing else. Some people tried to bring their bags into the truck, but they were thrown back. The soldiers had to load people, not the belongings. As a result, we had no mattresses or pillows when we arrived in Uzbekistan. We only took 1 quill blanket. In the dark of the night, we reached the Yevpatoria train station. We were placed into wagons and sent away. The wagon had 2 small windows on each side, but they were shut later. Our Sherfe and Lenifer were in our wagon. They had just recovered from typhoid. The sick ones were on one side and the rest of us were on the other. My brother, being sneaky, stood near the window all the time. Whenever the train stopped, he would quickly run out and fetch some water. During longer stops, my mom and other women would hop out and make small flatbreads. The trains would start moving again, leaving the breads half cooked. They provided us with food only once during the 18 days journey, and there were stale bread. An old man died. The adults told us not to look and instead search for lies on each other. Later, They left his body at one of the stations in the middle of Kazakhstan.
Thank you, Adia. Actually, I would like to show this this jug, which is mentioned in an interview by my grandmother. It's one of very few objects which actually are still in our life. It's actually, we had this jug which was porcelain, and it was it's quite a bad quality, but it didn't cost anything, or it's like it didn't have any value, and pretty much that's why we still have it, because they were not able to sell it during following years in deportation. So I asked my mom last year, after invasion started, she visited me once to bring it to me, as my grandmother has passed away. We also have two books, two Qurans actually, which are still in our house. But unfortunately, I'm not sure how to bring them to London, and now I'm not able to go to Crimea either. That Deportation Act, also it's pretty much, I'm sure that Adia herself probably has a story of grandparents who were deported in very similar way, when people were like just scared and didn't know what to do, and were just put in wagons and sent. They didn't know where they were sent, and they didn't know what they were to expect from this journey. This horrendous journey, so 194,000 people were deported from Crimea, from which 183,000 were Crimean Tatars. And that is not accounting men who were in Red Army in the front lines at the time, and people and Crimean Tatars who were on front line of the Soviet army after they finished, after the end of the war, they were sent to the deportation as well, actually. And I would like to share with you a map. Actually, this is first is like, actually, this is my grandmother, which is talking. Whose interview I recorded. This is my grandmother with her mom in Uzbekistan. Where is the map? Oh, here is a map. And so I just wanted to share this map of deportation from Soviet Union with you, as to show, I mean, there were Crimean Tatars were not only one. I mean, today is commemoration of course, it's a day of deportation of Crimean Tatars, but to put it in the larger context, Crimean Tatars, like in 1943 to 1944, between pretty much 1 year, there were over 1 million people, pretty much ethnic groups in Crimea, in Soviet Union, were deported. And those were Karachais, Kalmyks, Chechens, Ingush, Balkars, Crimean Tatars, and Turk-Meskhetians. And Lavrentiy Beria was in charge of all this deportation implementation. And this operation was carried out pretty much in Crimea and Caucasus, where all the other entire pretty much nations were deported to I don't know, the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia mostly. It's pretty much, if talking about why or reason, of course, on official level, Lavrentiy Beria and Stalin, as a justification for it, was accusation of all these nations and Crimean Tatars collaborating with Nazis during the war. Which were, first of all, false accusation, and second of all, if you look at a more broader perspective and looking at the Caucasus, actually, the green line is Maximum German advanced in 1942. So pretty much, Nazi Germany, a lot of these areas where other like Chechens and Ingush and Balkars and Turk-Meskhetins were deported from, Germans even didn't get to there. Nazi Germany even didn't get there. So there were clearly some other motives, and it was ethnic cleansing of the border territories of Soviet Union from unloyal, potentially unloyal to the Soviet Union. This potentially unloyal, probably we need to emphasize on potentially, as there were no proof really of being unloyal at the time. And I would show actually the just a second. I'm going to stop sharing here. Another interesting fact about all this deportation of Crimean Tatars is pretty much 32,000 troops, which of uncovered there, it's like internal troops, and the Soviet army were deployed to carry out deportation. And on top of it, a lot of other resources were thrown into it, including rail and trucks and all kind of things, which pretty much was in the middle of ongoing war. So all these resources were diverted from the war effort into deporting ethnic groups from their homeland, which consisted quite a lot like women, elderly, and children. As a lot of men from all of these ethnic groups were actually on the front line, then I would like to read the second part of my grandmother memories about deportation when they arrived in Uzbekistan. Yeah, as I just to remind that she was 11 years old when it happened. So eventually, we arrived at Mirzachol station, which translates as start step in Uzbekistan. After taking bus, we were sent to collective farms. During the journey, people started to starve. Months passed, and more starving people began to die. But my mother didn't sit idly by. She went around the village, talking to the neighbors and old ladies. She sewed clothes for them, mending every torn garment. In return, they would feed her and sometimes give her a piece of flatbread, flour, or corn to ensure that we children wouldn't die. Even though they were also hungry and didn't have much, there were those among them who shared what little they had. My mother would eat half of what she received, hiding the rest, and then bring it to us. It was a constant struggle to survive. I found some grass, horse sorrel, and onions. I mixed them with flour and made a thin soup. My mother would give us food, and in a separate tiny bowl, she would give me a few spoons of soup, instructing me to go and feed a girl who was on the verge of starvation. She cautioned me not to let my brother know, as he was protective and we ourselves were starving. I hid the bowl under my apron, carefully fed the girl, gave her water. Meanwhile, my mother went to bury those who had passed away. She would wash them, wrap the bodies in old sheets and rugs, and bury them. My mother had a few strands of pearls, which she divided into pieces and sold to wealthier Uzbeks. She sold everything she had, clothes, scarves, and whatever possession remained. We didn't even have a bed, so we cut reeds and fashioned a makeshift one. The satin duvet my father had brought from Turkey was repurposed by my mother. She took the satin fabric, sewed an Uzbek dress, and sold it. We made a simple cover for ourselves, using my mother's old dresses. The three of us slept under that cover. We survived. As a child, I didn't know that it was a deportation. How could I know? We continued living, and I told everyone at school in Uzbekistan that we weren't deported, that was a war going on, and we were evacuated in 1944. Throughout my childhood, my mother always used to say, "Your father will come back. Your brother will be back from the Soviet army." She claimed that many people were sent to Samarkand in 1938, and that some pilgrims had even spotted my father there. She lived with a hope that my father and brother would return. Whenever she acquired some jam or sugar, she would split it in half, saving the other half in case my father or brother came back. My mother and Aunt Zilha were always whispering together and crying. Whenever I approached them, they would stop. I would ask, "Why is that?" My mother replied, "If you know everything, they'll kick you out of school. You won't go to school." That's how we lived. They didn't tell me anything. We are not guilty of anything. It was a mistake that they brought us here. I often overheard from them. Rumors spread that echelons from Samarkand were coming, and they wondered if they would take us back home. Every day, they prayed to return to Crimea. They cursed Stalin and said, "Allah boynuna, let God punish him on his neck." When Stalin died in 1953, I was in 10th grade. We attended the march and cried that our leader had died. But then we went around the corner and laughed, wiping our eyes. The Soviet Union deceived not only me, but all people. But why would I think about it? Why would I protest? Why? They would arrest me as well. This is true. Why did they arrest so many writers? Because they questioned. Thank you. That was it was my grandmother memories as well, and so the thing with her father, who was executed in 37, 38, he was arrested, so they didn't know what really happened to him, and they were didn't know for a very long time, so they thought he just will someday come back. And they did find out about her brother in late 60s or 70s that they found him in Turkey. Someone sent a little postcard saying that he was alive. And my grandmother found out the fate of her father. I mean, she probably suspected that he was executed, but she found out, like, in fact, when she went in archives in 90s, when we returned to Crimea, she got a little document saying that he was executed. And another thing is, like, it's kind of which I wanted to mention is kind of a collective amnesia, I guess, and it was dangerous to talk, right? So, I mean, it's not in this piece, but my grandmother had like a fight with her history teacher about deportation and evacuation as well, and it was everyone knew that you can, it's like there is consequences of talking about these things, and they lived in the settlement regime still pretty much 1956, 57 after Stalin death, and they had to sign every time they left, or they got to get a paper permission to leave the settlement if they would leave the place. So what happened is, like, in 1956, five of 7 entire nations which were deported were allowed pretty much to go back to their homeland, which were Karachais, Kalmyks, Chechens, Ingush, and Balkars. But Crimean Tatars and Turkmenians were not allowed. And actually, in Soviet Union, the ethnicity as Crimean Tatar kind of was erased and didn't exist. So, like, if you would want to receive a passport, it would say not Crimean Tatar, it would say Tatar. And one of the, like, justification was that it's like a twisted Soviet history that Crimean Tatars and Tatars in Tatarstan, Kazan Tatars were the same people as the same ethnic group, and then there were Tatar Soviet Republic. So at that time, when in '56, like other people were allowed to go back, Crimean Tatars were told, "Oh, you can go to Tatarstan if you would like to." Even though Crimean Tatars, even though we share the name Tatars, we don't have much. I mean, there is cultural similarities, but we are not the same people. It's the word Tatars itself is more generic word, like Slavs, let's say, which covers quite a lot of ethnic groups. And but this event itself, when during Khrushchev, these other deported people were allowed to go back, pretty much sparkled the hope among Crimean Tatars to go back, and gave a push for Crimean Tatar national movement, which started pretty much in mid-50s with a lot of. It started actually with a lot of former Crimean Tatar partisans and former Soviet Crimean Tatar soldiers, pretty much writing the letters or petition to the Soviet Верховный Sovietist government, and it developed quite a lot into the 60s, when there were a delegation of Crimean Tatars were sent to Moscow, and resulted that in 1967 there were kind of not publicized ruling of Presidium of Soviet government that Crimean Tatars are not banned anymore to go to Crimea, but they have to go with a passport and work regime. They have to, pretty much what it meant that if you want to go back to Crimea, you're allowed to, but to settle there, you have to have a job and something called passport registration, or registration in your passport with address. But internally in Crimea, everyone in administration were given order: do not register Crimean Tatars in Crimea and don't give jobs to Crimea. So there were a movement of Crimean Tatars trying to move back to Crimea, and some of them camped in Simferopol in '60s, like for a month, and some of them even bought the houses, but they would not get a document that they owe the house, so they wouldn't get this address registration in that house, and in the end they were deported back again. So I have some family members who were tried to go back to Crimea in '60s, but as no one had a lot of savings and people still were quite poor, pretty much they didn't last long without job and without registration, and they were sent back pretty much within a month. And then under the pressure, Soviet Union also got this new program in late '60s, which was called Verbovka, which was resettlement of Crimean Tatars into collective farms in northern Crimea. But with that program, it was kind of, it's like kind of like little carrot, which in the first year, there were like 50 families which were moved. The second year, it was 30 families, and next year was 20 families. So it's like about 80 families were allowed to return to Crimea. And when I say families, it's usually not extended families. There were couples, or couples with 1 or 2 kids. And actually, one of the village where I grew up in northern Crimea had a collective farm received some of the Crimean Tatar families, and I actually in one of the projects interviewed them about it. But a mass return of Crimean Tatars after was pretty much dedicated by 2 factors. With general change of political situation in Soviet Union, as Soviet Union was going into the end pretty much in 1989. But in 1987 was a significant event in the history of Soviet Union as well, I would say. There were about 2,000 Crimean Tatars were demonstrating in Moscow, and that Crimean Tatar movement itself is one of the like peaceful protest movement in Soviet Union. And that protest itself of kind of like a mass protest got a lot of international attention at the time. And that was followed by unrest in Uzbekistan itself, when Turk Meskhetins, one of the other groups which was deported from Caucasus, there were pogroms of Turk Meskhetins in 1989 Uzbekistan, where pretty much Uzbek groups were just burning the houses and throwing stones into the houses, mark the houses. It actually happened in the village and collective farm Lenina, where I'm from. It's probably happened when I was already a baby. And so there were like this ethnic unrest happening in Uzbekistan, and there were this pretty much like going, like saying Turks need to go back home to their homeland, Russians go back to Russia, and Crimean Tatars go back home to Crimea. And so this also changed quite a lot of attitude in Crimean Tatars, because by that time, a lot of Crimean Tatars were quite settled in Uzbekistan, but after this event, pretty much the attitude changed quite a lot, and everyone was ready to leave. On top of national movement, on top of that, like everyone wanted to go home. On that, I'll finish my part, and I'll give word to Lily, who would talk a little bit more about her experience working as a journalist in Crimea and as a writer, and doing her research since late 90s to today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emine. Lily, thank you.
Thank you, Emine, for inviting me, for organising this event. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Yeah, I thought I'd talk a bit about the 18th of May demonstrations that I went to in Crimea. As Emine said, I first found out about the Crimean Tatars at the end of the 90s. Before, I had no idea that these people existed, that they had this amazing story, not just of exile and repression, but also that they'd had a peaceful national movement that existed in the Soviet Union, and even actually achieved its aim of coming a bit of attitudes when they did come back. So the first commemorative event I went to was the 55th anniversary of the deportation. So that was in 1999. That year, 7 columns of people marched from all over the peninsula. I joined the ones who came from Bakhtisarai in the southwest, and they gathered in the bus station in Simferopol before moving to the city centre. It was a pause where people were eating plov from these huge communal pots. They were distributing flags and placards, and there were a lot of people greeting each other who hadn't seen each other for months or even a year. I remember there was a lot of anger about current and past injustices in Crimea. The Crimean Tatar representative body had no official recognition in Ukraine. Neither did Crimean Tatar language or schools, and there was no guarantee that Crimean Tatars would get land plots. This was when collective farms were being broken up. This was also the first time I started hearing first-hand stories about the deportation, like Emine's grandmother's story. The Ukrainian family I was staying with didn't want me to go to the march. They warned me to be careful. For them, Crimean Tatars were like an alien invasion to be scared of. No one seemed to know much about them. Obviously, I just heard that they were stirring up ethnic tension. What I remember about that march, as an outsider and a journalist, there was nothing threatening at all, even when all the columns got together. There were 18,000 people at that march. From that day to this, there's never been any violence or clashes associated with 18th of May gatherings in Crimea, as far as I know. They were political occasions, but they were also social occasions, especially before mobile phones. It was when people got together and shared their personal news. So I was researching my book Dreamland after that, and I went to several 18th of May meetings. The police presence got less. The political message, I would say, got more diffuse, which I guess is inevitable. After the Crimean Tatars achieved their main aim of coming back, then people got kind of distracted with their own lives, getting on with studying, teaching, having families, starting businesses, starting cultural organizations. But these meetings were still political events and important historical reminders and social occasions. Then 2014 annexation. I'm not sure, I think Emine possibly has a photograph of this one. This is the last 18th of May meeting I went to. This was in Crimea in 2014. 70 years since the deportation, so it should have been a very special commemoration. I took a train from Kiev. This was after the referendum, but there were still trains running from Kiev then. And the first thing I saw was a row of prison vans. The entire center of Simferopol was barricaded by thousands of Russian riot police. Nobody in the city center. I took a bus out to a suburb, a Crimean Tatar suburb called Akhmechet. And as it headed out of town, it started filling up with Crimean Tatars, and they started taking Crimean Tatar flags out of their backpacks or their bags. It was like the meeting in 1999, but in reverse. In 1999, everybody gathered on the outskirts and then flowed together into the center. And this time, everybody was like trickling together little by little to go out to the edge of town to Akhmechet. The Russian installed authorities had banned any public gatherings, but there were thousands at that meeting in Akhmechet, and nobody could hear any speeches because there were police helicopters circling overhead the whole time. This was the last 18th of May gathering of any size in Crimea since 2014. That area outside the mosque in Akhmechet was fenced off and dug up afterwards, allegedly for building, but actually so that nobody could use it for meetings. And anybody who has any kind of active position now gets warnings before the 18th of May from the FSB or the police saying that they shouldn't engage in any gatherings or any supposed extremist activities. What about the rest of Crimeans? What was their attitude? How did that change? So in 2016, I wrote an article about a lot of new monuments that have been put up in Crimea since annexation, telling new versions of history, historical memory. One was a statue to Catherine II, who annexed Crimea in 1783. This is a copy of an older statue which had been melted down and recast as Lenin, so already tells you something about the permanence of historical memory. And I got talking to two women who were sitting near it. They were both from Crimea, and they both worked in historical memory themselves. One was a tour guide, one was selling souvenirs at the airport. And they both ended up talking about Crimean Tatars on the 18th of May. They told me that every year before 2014, when they said Putin saved them from the Tatars, they were scared. They didn't even want to leave the house on the 18th of May. It was out of like a powder keg, they said. If you lit a match, everything would have exploded. And talking about the situation after annexation, I want to quote what one of them said. She said, "Not anymore. Now it's all civilized. The Tatars have their monuments and sacred places where they're allowed to go. They can go to mosque. The authorities are building them such a beautiful mosque now. They live very well. No one is repressing them." The same woman then invited me to a Crimean Tatar cafe for a cup of tea. Her attitude, it seemed to me, a colonial attitude, but a particularly post-Soviet one that equates non-Russian culture of the Russian Empire with that Soviet bogeyman of nationalism, while claiming to respect and promote them. These are the cultures, and I would include Ukraine in this, as well as the Ukrainian Crimean Tatar. They're rendered harmless by being reduced to food or folk songs or costumes, kind of ethnic kitsch. So now you're here, now it's all civilized. The Tatars have their monuments and sacred places where they're allowed to go. So since 2014, this space where they're allowed to go has got smaller and smaller. Most Crimean Tatars and anyone who doesn't agree with annexation has retreated completely into internal exile. Independent public life barely exists. No NGOs, no civic groups, no journalism as such. Religion, but only in a strictly controlled form. Instead, there's the overwhelming effect of 24/7 propaganda and what you might call facts on the ground, I guess. Everyone has to operate within a Russian legal, social and law enforcement framework. Law enforcement being the most important, because the bottom line is that hundreds of Crimean Tatars and others have been harassed, fined, detained, tortured, disappeared and imprisoned since 2014. So by my last trip in 2018, it was impossible to do any reporting from Crimea. Nobody will talk to you. Doesn't matter if they support annexation or not. Nobody wants to talk, or if they do talk, they say afterwards, but you can't publish it. The only ones who were willing to speak out, as Emine mentioned, they were relatives of political prisoners or disappeared people, maybe because they had nothing to lose. There's also a perception that speaking out is a kind of protection. Everybody seems disillusioned. Supporters of annexation still blame Ukraine for everything that's gone wrong, and those who oppose annexation also blame Ukraine. I find some of them, they have this nihilistic attitude that Ukraine also betrayed them. I also heard from some Crimean Tatars that the Tatars were themselves to blame. They betrayed themselves, and this terrible fate that's befallen them in Crimea was the result of falling away from Islam or political infighting or forgetting their culture and language. I think the 18th of May commemorations are important because they confirmed personal relations and identity within a group shared history and historical memory. And that's why Russia banned them, not just as a reminder of atrocities and this non-Russian Crimean history. Today's Russia resembles Soviet totalitarianism in that it sets out to impose one version of history defined by the state and destroy any space for expressing a different version. And private life and relationships built on trust and shared history or stories are deliberately being destroyed, because then all that's left is to conform to the approved group think, or to be left completely alone with the whole weight of the state security apparatus against you. This is one of the things I'm writing about in the book I'm working on about Crimea after annexation, which I'd like to read an extract from it now, which covers exactly this. It's based on true stories. Some of them have been made public, some of them haven't. So that's why I've used the form of fiction to write about them. So this is an extract from a story called The Pot. He got up early as usual after the usual night and went downstairs to the workshop where Adem didn't turn up. Adem helped out, now Eskender's hands were unreliable. It wasn't as if there were many orders these days, but people did occasionally still want traditional pottery, and Eskender didn't want to let them down. He had to make as much of a living as he could, since Azi had lost Shevket's income. He called Adem's phone, no answer. A minute later, Adem called back from a new number, but when Eskender answered, it wasn't him. It was the fellow who bought the car. Eskender's heart sank. Selling the car so quickly had been one of the few pieces of luck they'd had recently. Odd kind of luck, now that Shevket needed expensive prison parcels more than he needed the old car. But it was all right, the buyer explained, just a bit of missing paperwork, receipts from the last MOT. He'd be driving along the highway to Alushta this morning, so he could pick them off at the turnoff. Eskender put the phone down, staring out of the workshop window, not seeing the glorious Crimean view, the sea dividing the sky with a perfectly level line of indigo. This was the way life went on. Didn't matter whether you hated or loved yourself. You still went to bed. You still woke up. The sea was still there. You made things, sold things. Your worker didn't turn up. There were confusions with paperwork. and made you waste 40 minutes rummaging through drawers because the receipts weren't there. His sister Ozzy couldn't find them at home either. When Eskender called the number back, no one answered. Feeling baffled and pointless as usual, Eskender locked up and set off down the steep road through the village to meet the man who bought the car and explained there was nothing to do in the workshop anyway without Adam. The buyer was waiting at the highway turn next to the parked car. He waved at Eskender and then gestured towards the bus stop. Eskender looked over. The two uniformed men in the bus shelter came out, seized him, turned him, twisted his arms behind his back. He found himself rammed into the side of his car. Through the glass of the back door window, he could see the familiar worn seats inside, littered with crumpled paper bags and coffee cups, and laid over them the reflection of his own mashed face out of focus, behind it 2 heads in balaclavas. They took away his wallet, keys, and phone. They opened the door and put him inside, between them. The buyer got in front, started the car, and began to drive up the hill. I don't understand, Eskender said at last. You actually bought my car. My wife's got a Skoda like this, one of the balaclavas said. They're not bad. The buyer drove too fast up the steep hill. Jeep would be better on these roads, Balaclava added. At the workshop, the search had already started. They'd kicked in the door that Eskender had so carefully locked half an hour before. More men in FSB uniform and balaclavas. Perhaps they were already at Arzy's house too. He couldn't call her to ask, as usual. Here we go again. He'd fallen for the exact same trick as last time. He should have left Crimea after that time. He should have left before this happened. He should not have spoken, never filed that complaint, never have woken up. It would be nice to call it courage, but it wasn't. It was some vast, inert failure of imagination. It was an effort to push through it enough even to ask, where are the search witnesses? To say, I want my lawyer. No one bothered to reply. What are you looking for? Not that it mattered. While he'd been walking to the highway turning, they could have planted whatever they wanted. Men came out of the workshop carrying the jar of knives and scalpels he used for trimming and decorating his pots. A bunch of books and papers he'd already looked through for the receipts an hour ago. Among them was the envelope containing about a quarter of the cash from selling the car. He'd been unable to put it in a bank, of course, with the Chevket on the terrorism list. Thank heaven Arzy had spent the rest of it. The bills were paid off for now, small mercies. It was only when the search was over and they put him in another car and were driving down the hill again that he started to shake and feel sick. I want my lawyer, he said. Then, where's Adam? His throat was already seizing up in agonized disgust. Sliced open with his own scalpels would be better than this physical certainty of what they were going to do to him soon, what he would do to himself, the sudden air going down and the acid vomit coming up and drowning him inside the bag. All his fault. He should have left Crimea, should not have stayed, should never have spoken, never complained. Distance yourself, Eskender. The bag, plastic, him, winded by blows, desperately sucking in air, and all that came in was the slimy plastic. Try to distance yourself, his lawyer Fatima had said, laying the pen in front of him. Calm, polite concern on her broad face, framed by the pink or lilac scarf she wore, always some soft baby colour. The baby had been on the table beside them, in one of those chairs you could strap into a car seat, a row of bright plastic shapes strung across the front. Then they put a plastic bag over my head, he'd written, and the baby had woken up and bashed at the toys. And then Fatima took it away, and you'd heard her soft murmur from the other room. He'd written it all down for her, in ballpoint blue, straggling handwriting. Fatima had gone through it with him, asking questions, quietly correcting a couple of spellings. She'd made him read carefully what he'd written before he signed. Instead of leaving Crimea, he'd written it all down, apparently so that now he could compare how accurate his recollection of 2 years ago in an FSB building had been to the real thing. Instead, it was nothing like he remembered. Once they took away the coat with which they'd muffled his head, there were windows. Even the walls were a different colour. His guards escorted him to a bench in a light, quiet corridor and left him, with just one balaclava guard at the other end of the bench who ignored him. Eskender sat, phoneless, keyless, moneyless, passportless. Eventually a door opened and Sergei Afanasyevich came out carrying a folder. At first Eskender thought the FSB officer was going to ignore him too, but then Afanasyevich nodded. You again. He opened the folder and read from something inside. The investigation committee has found no evidence to support the claim brought by lawyer Abduramanova Fatimeh that the Russian Federal Security Bureau departments and representatives named blah 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 on April 20 to 21st, 2015 exceeded their authority in the treatment of Dolberov Eskender Mukhtarovich, born 1972, Uzbekistan, attended school number 4, Churchik, in different marks, 1987 to 1989, cautioned repeatedly for hooliganism, 1990 kicked out of college, moved to Crimea, blah, blah, blah. He looked up again. I suppose you think you're a brave man now? Eskender shrugged. Or she told you speaking out publicly was some kind of protection. Is that how she persuaded you? Fucking lawyers. How much are they bleeding you for? Afanasyevich reopened the door he'd just come out of. A word, Eskender Mukhtarovich. I'm not saying anything without my lawyer. She's on her way. She called 40 minutes ago and asked us to tell you. She had to wait for the babysitter. A word. It was quite a pleasant room, with a heavy new desk under the photo of Putin and long cream strip blinds over the windows. Eskender sat on the wooden chair. Afanasyevich leaned against the desk next to him. So you lied, Eskender Mukhtarovich. Not much courage in that. Eskender said nothing. Do you know how much your lawyer is actually making? It's not just what they get from you. They get money from foreign governments to take these cases. Did you know that? They're getting very fat indeed off the persecution of the Crimean Tatars. Eskender mumbled something. What was that? I said, no, I didn't know. Now you do. She knew it was hopeless, your complaint. These people make a living out of maligning the Russian state. Afanasyevich took a phone from his pocket. You're not on Facebook, are you? Eskender shrugged. I asked, are you on Facebook? You know I'm not. Then have a look. He held out the phone to show Fatimeh's Facebook page. Afanasyevich's thumb, with its very broad, neatly trimmed nail, scrolled through posts about fake evidence, coerced witnesses, a UN hearing about arrests and disappearances in Crimea, Fatimeh smiling, holding an award from a British human rights organisation, illegal searches, FSB intimidation, torture with impunity. Names and faces Eskender recognised, of Fatimeh and her colleagues' clients now in prison, slid up and under his thumb and vanished. Quite the campaign, and yet they've never won a single case. Not a single case. Your neighbour Ibrahim was sentenced to 7 years for fundamentalist beliefs you know he holds. That's not so long. He'd already done 2 in pre-trial. Your lawyer appealed his sentence, and now Ibrahim's in prison for 19 years. 19. But, Eskender mumbled. What was that? Eskender shook his head. They co-opted you for their global disinformation campaign, and now you're paying the price. I suppose she told you publicity makes you safe. I suppose she said you could win this case that we, what was it? Exceeded our authority. She told you you're being brave. Afanasyevich turned the phone screen away again. What? But what? You began to object before. Continue. What? Eskender rubbed his face with his hands. He was getting a headache. Why did Ibrahim get 19 years second time round? Because it's the law. I'm not the judge. I don't know all the fucking details. How old will your nephew Shevket be when he finishes his new sentence? I'd like to wait outside for my lawyer, Eskender said, flattening his trembling hands between his knees. I don't see perjury on this list. Afanasyevich was still scrolling on the phone. But you perjured yourself, Eskender. No, I didn't. We know you did. You admitted it yourself in your complaint. No, I signed a false statement under duress and I retracted it. So you lied. No. All right, yes, you forced me to lie. And then I told the truth about it. Eskender took several deep breaths, forcing himself to calm down. It was that statute he should cite. He should cite it and shut up. but you made me sign a false statement that first time you detained me in 2015. Then, when you took me to court to be a secret witness, I retracted it. I retracted my statement publicly in my own name. I described exactly how you made me give false evidence against Ibrahim. I made a complaint and my lawyer brought the case against you for it, for he tried to control his stutter, for exceeding your authority. How heroic. It's not, it's just true. And then you, Iskender rubbed his face again. Where's Adem? Who? Adem Shulgar. He helps me out in the workshop. He didn't turn up for work this morning. No idea, never heard of him. Then why did you buy the car? Iskender said. Just so you could bring me in today? Afanasovich took 2 papers from the folder and laid them on the desk in front of Iskender. I want my lawyer. I told you she's on her way. Read. Iskender read the papers. The printed words wriggled and danced. He put out a finger to pin them down, one after another, along the lines. I don't understand, he said. Now you're charging me with giving false evidence. Of course, you admit yourself, as does your lawyer, that you committed perjury. Because you forced me to. If now you're charging me with lying when you forced me to lie, then you're admitting the whole case was made up, that you exceeding, there was torture. After that commission cleared you, it's yourself you're charging with perjury, not me. So you mean now you're lying about lying? Stop it, Iskender said. Just stop. Please, if you don't mind, I'm leaving. The officer tapped the second paper. Leaving the building, Iskender clarified. I need to go home. What about your lawyer? Afanasovich held out a pen, indicating the second paper, which was an obligation not to leave Crimea for the duration of the perjury case against him. Sign that and you can go. For now. Keep listening.
Thank you, Lily. Yeah, unfortunately, since annexation of Crimea in 2014, these cases, even though the piece Lily read is fictional, unfortunately, these cases became the reality for many Crimean Tatars. And the sentences of 19 and 25 years are also quite real, unfortunately. But it's unfortunate, and also like what Lily said about the public spaces and how little it became for Crimean Tatars even to discuss or meet is like shrinking day by like month by month after annexation. And so like and all the religious gathering which are still happening and still allowed to be happening, unlike the political ones. The thing is, like, everyone knows that for every like religious gathering and mosque, there is someone from FSB, or like someone is like, it's everyone's like afraid to talk. But I'm just going to wrap up all this event and to go to questions section. But I just want to say that 18th of May and Deportation Day is very important for every single Crimean Tatar event, and we all have relatives which haven't survived it. And unfortunately, this bloody story like continues. And since 2014, the situation for Crimean Tatars in Crimea like got much worsened quite a lot. But on deportation, it also didn't come. The story itself didn't come completely around and doesn't have a kind of an ending, which probably we would like to have. As there is no justice, and I personally myself are still waiting for a day, and I would like to see the day when retrospectively post-mortem Stalin and Beria and other people who were involved in this deportation and war crimes and war crimes against and ethnic cleansing during Soviet times and during Second World War will be tried for what they did. And I think this justice would would bring some peace of mind for a lot of people, for a lot of Crimean Tatars. And so I'll pretty much will be finishing here. And I want to thank for everyone. And if people have questions, we'll go to questions.
Thank you so much, all of you, Emine, Lily, and Edia. We have 20 minutes or so, just under 20 minutes for questions. So like I said earlier, please either put your hand up and we'll unmute you, or write your questions in chat. I think we already have one question in chat, but let me see if anybody wants to begin by asking a question live. Just put your hand up if you can. Emine, can you see the question in chat?
Yeah. Let me see.
Andrea,
Okay, the question.
Here, would you like to ask your question live, Andrei? I'm just unmuting you. Yeah, there you go.
No, that's fine. Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to read it so that everyone understands. Thank you so much, Emine, Edie, and Lily, for your beautiful collective and personal stories, and doubly so for all the very important and vital work that you do. Here in the U.S., I'm in the New York metropolitan area, and although I'm kind of like a news junkie and news and policy nerd, there's very little or nothing that's broadcast about in the public sphere, that is, about the plight of Crimean Tatars, whether it's historical past in the 20th century or during the annexation, before and after the annexation, or even now during the current war. So, and then there's also very little or nothing about its very rich cultural legacy. Are you aware of any community efforts to or activistically to propagate advocacy in the public sphere and for more visibility, whether it be journalistic, diplomatic, or cultural? Because we do have a representative, a Crimean Tatar representative to the UN here in the US, but there's very little that's shown to the public about its plight, the community plight, and its cultural activities. So I'm just curious to see if there's anything that any kind of efforts are being done to mitigate that.
I'll probably start answering. There is definitely some diplomatic initiatives which are led by Ukrainian Institute, not the Ukrainian Institute in London, but Ukrainian Institute in Ukraine, like Ukrainian from Ukraine, and Crimean House. And so I definitely know that they launched the kind of multimedia history in English, a history over course of Crimea and Crimean Tatars. Actually, was probably last year, and also they try to do events and things, but unfortunately, it's kind of it does get lost in all of the events which are happening in Ukraine, and since full-scale invasion, which started in last year, pretty much, but. I want to say it's there is also, like, probably Lily also can talk about it, because me and Lily, we work as journalists in Crimea, especially in 2015, 2016. We mostly, I kind of stopped working there around 2017. It's it's very, very hard to publish or pitch any kind of story from Crimea to international media, especially maybe right now a little bit more interest in Ukraine in general. But the problem now, you cannot report from Crimea at all. It's like the access is like impossible. And if you do have access, you pretty much run a risk of being detained and put in jail forever. And so, like, but prior this, in 2000, even after annexation of Crimea, the general public and audience, it's like, Lily probably can talk a little bit more, but it's also quite a twisted, quite a twisted reality which we ran into, because a lot of Crimean Tatar activists are being charged, and businessmen and stuff, but a lot of these people would not go public or would not talk to journalists. So the stories themselves are hard to access. And the stories you access, a lot of them are Hizbut Tahrir cases, which is religious, one of the religious, more orthodox Muslim groups, which are hard to pitch as well, partly because Hizbut Tahrir himself, even though there is no proof these people are part of Hizbut Tahrir, it's a little controversial, like group, which is, and in Russia they labeled as terrorists, even though they're legal, like in UK, let's say. There is like this story just doesn't, I think audience is not, I mean, it's so complex that like stories like, and in media you have to explain everything with 500, 1,000 words. Usually it doesn't like kind of fly. But Lily, do you want to talk a little bit more? Because you actually continued after I moved to London to work on Crimea. And I know that you every year try to pitch stories on Crimea. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about it.
Yeah, thanks, Emine. Basically, just to absolutely agree with you. This tactic of Russia to prosecute people for alleged membership in an Islamic organization, it's such a clever tactic, because if you pitch that story to Western media, the bottom line for editors is, oh, but maybe they really are Muslim terrorists. And you never get beyond that to say, we're looking at a completely different situation. This is a situation of an annexation of a part of the country and a repression of a group of people who opposed annexation. There's always this, I mean, very rarely editors have told me this directly, but at the back of their minds, that's why they wouldn't take stories, because they worried these people really were terrorists. Like dissidents in the Soviet Union, the West supported them because they didn't think what they did were crimes, right? They were whatever, enemies of the state or contra-revolutionaries. Nobody in the West took those seriously as crimes. Whereas people in Crimea now, they're being accused of terrorism, they're being accused of sabotage, they're being accused of blowing up pipelines, gas pipelines, threatening people's lives, or of being Islamic fundamentalists. And yeah, Western media don't want to touch those stories. I'd say now it's a bit different. There's more interest in Crimea now. It's become, people understand that it's absolutely, what happens to Crimea is absolutely key to Russia's war in Ukraine.
Thank you both.
But
Sorry, go ahead, Lily. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. There was a pause.
okay. So yeah, it's becoming more of a story now. People understand how key it is to explain the background, particularly about Crimean Tatars, without it also becoming this kind of like ethnic kitsch that I was talking about. Because, I don't know, sometimes it sort of falls into stories about costume or music, which are important, but not related to current realities, I would say.
Thank you both so much for that answer. So we have a question. I can see one hand up, but just before Christina will invite you to ask your question, there's another one that was sent in chat from Linda Goff. I'll just read it out. So it says, I have a question. What does Emine think the future holds if Ukraine kicks Russia out of Crimea? Would Crimean Tatars want to join Ukraine? Rejoin, I guess, be an autonomous republic within Ukraine, be a separate state, be another oblast? What is her prediction, if I may ask? And I would love to hear from Lily as well.
This is a question. It's quite a big question, right? On what politically would happen to Crimea. It was Autonomic Republic of Crimea, which now under Russian illegal annexation is de facto treated as oblast or administrative region without autonomy. And of course, Crimean Tatar Majlis position, and a lot of Crimean Tatars always dreamed, and one of the demands on the return of Crimean Tatars was to make national autonomous republic with national element to it, because Crimean Tatars are indigenous people to Crimea, and there were Crimean Tatar state before historically, but of course history is not always a good argument. But I can see reintegration of Crimea. I personally I like as idea and theory idea of Crimean Tatar Autonomic Republic, but I don't think it's possible on practical level, including Crimean Tatars make about 15 to 20% of population of Crimea, as well that we're talking about human resources and skills, and a lot of after annexation of Crimea, the most active part of young Crimean Tatars who were politically and socially active, they left Crimea because it was impossible for them to stay and to continue working. And a lot of this, I mean, people, including, I don't know, okay, my case is a little different. I moved in 2004, not in 2014 from Crimea, but it's a question how would you return these people, including Crimean Tatars, back to Crimea, when also probably if we reintegrate Crimea, we would have hostile population to Ukrainian government as well, which is, even though I'm quite sure that it's possible to reintegrate this population, we still would have, I don't know, 50 to 60% of population, right, who in pseudo polling in 2014 March voted for or had some pro-Russian views and voted for Russia. It's like not voted, polled. They polled in their poll. It's like it was illegal polling. I even don't want to call it referendum. And to return it to the way it was, Autonomous Republic of Crimea with electoral parties, it's probably not an option, because you would have again some kind of weird parties getting into parliament and government. But also Ukraine is not a federation, it's a unitarian country. It's like, it didn't make sense to have this republic at the first place, I think. So I think there is a lot of risk and there is a lot of issues to mitigate and go through, but I would say probably I'm not really an expert to say what political structure it should be, but I hope it will happen, and some kind of smart people in the government would decide what to do, and it wouldn't be a wrong decision. But I definitely would like to have Crimean Tatar representative and more representative into the government and all the kind of decision-making institutions in Crimea and in Ukraine as well, because this is important part of life, and it's also quite there is a lot of agency and there is a lot of political motivation and among Crimean Tatar population, and there is a lot of political will to be engaged. And also the view of Crimea as a homeland is not just like a transitional land. It's very important, and it's defined your view, how you see yourself and how you see the future of your kids there and things. So it's like quite important when you talk about the governance.
Thank you. And Lily, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, just very briefly, yeah, it's a very important and very difficult question. So I know Ukraine has been developing a strategy to reintegrate Crimea since 2020, I think. It was part of the Crimea platform, which was launched in 2021. So yes, people in Ukraine have been thinking about this seriously for a while. I mean, I don't know what the official positioning is now on a Crimean Tatar autonomy. I know that Poroshenko backed this, but I don't actually know what Zelensky's position is on it. But I do think that Ukraine obviously really needs the Crimean Tatars as the one population that has an absolutely unquestionable claim, if that's the right word, to Crimea, and which supports Ukraine.
Thank you so much. And we have a question that's going to be our last question, I'm afraid, for tonight from Christina Passion, please, if you can unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this wonderful webinar. Thank you so much. One question I did have, so I'm sure you heard of the Levada Center. It's apparently an independent polling group in Russia. It's independent from the government, they say. And they released at least 2 polls, one before the war started, claiming that in their interviews with Crimean Tatars, that about 60% are now okay with Russia, you know, having control of the peninsula, and with the annexation that they approve of it now. And the way they do their methodology is that they apparently go door to door and interview people in person, which to me seems, you know, in a country like Russia where any sort of dissent is penalized, sounds to me very sketchy. So I was just curious, you know, as 2 experts yourselves, what do you think of these polls that the Levada Center released? Could they be accurate, or are they not at all accurate? Thank you.
Lily, maybe you should start talking, since you the last was in Crimea on reporting and trying to interview people.
Well, exactly. Nobody will talk to you in Crimea. So it seems to me that obviously they can't be relied on, particularly, as you said, door to door, where there's no possible anonymity. And it's not just the Levada Center. There's been some, to my mind, extremely questionable Western researchers who've allegedly done polls in Crimea and come up with similar results. If you look at who funds these people, I have some, and their methodology, I have some extremely big questions. So no, I would say that it's just irrelevant. It doesn't tell you anything about the real situation in Crimea. I mean, I can say that, you know, my experience is also irrelevant, because obviously I wasn't doing any kind of systematic polling or questions, but just for what it's worth, my personal experience is that I do see a lot of disillusionment among Crimean Tatars, but that does not equate with being okay with Russia, not in any sense. It's you know, they have to make a best of a bad job, but that doesn't equate with being okay with it. And also being disappointed in Ukraine does not like equate with thinking it's okay to be annexed by Russia.
I would say that just being a repressed ethnic minority, when you know that anything you say is like can turn around to you with FSB coming to your house, and FSB like having been doing searches in Crimean Tatar neighborhood constantly, like with like diligence every 2 months, every month. They come to all different kind of Crimean Tatar neighborhoods and settlements, and they search houses, so it's like everyone in the neighborhood see. And sometimes it's like it's just like kind of like a showcase almost. I mean, and so to live in this kind of situation when all the population know that they can be a target, and you know that you're Crimean Tatar and you can be a target, and you have this experience of family trauma, of like people being arrested, people being deported, people being like discriminated against, like for like in the job market and the housing market. Like it's actually like we're going about 90s as well. This is like experience probably of mine and 80 years as well, of being like discriminated in Crimea. And so like to respond openly to these questions, I would say probably not. And I can even see like I've been last time in Crimea in 2021. And I want to say, even in the family gatherings, when it's for the prayer, let's say, even then people, I think like people are cautious what they say on anything which could be perceived political. And especially people who work in any kind of government institutions, like being a teacher, being a medical worker, being like any kind of like doing any kind of administrative work. And so to get to the point when people start talking to you what they really think, you need to be like very close with them and like either indication. Even I want to say, even when my mom came visit last year, it took days before she started talking about what's happening over there. And sometimes it would be just like, I would ask questions, shut down. I was like, Mom, you're not, I mean, it's very weird. And so I wouldn't say that these polls are fabricated. They're probably not fabricated, but could they reflect the real situation on support of Russia? Probably not.
Thank you so much for your questions. Unfortunately, we're out of time, and I'm sure many of you have many more questions, but we will continue talking about Crimea for sure. So keep an eye on our program. And before I thank our speakers, I just wanted to make a couple of announcements. Tomorrow, we're hosting Olena Styashkina, writer from Donetsk, at UCL in partnership with the School of Slavonic and East European Studies. If you're in London, please do join us. It's also going to be recorded, and we'll post it on our YouTube channel. So please subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't done so yet, so you can be notified when the recordings, such as tonight's recording, are available to view and share. And also wanted to make a very exciting announcement that we will be hosting Serhiy Zhadan and his band in June, and here's the link. So if you're not in London, come to London and see Zhadan perform here, and he will be fundraising for his foundation that supports Eastern Ukraine. So please do follow us on social media to keep an eye on our program of events and projects. And I'd just like to thank once again Lily Hyde for sharing your insights with us, Ediye Katman for reading so touchingly the testimonies, and Emine Ziyatdinova for curating this webinar, for putting it together, for telling us the history of this painful anniversary, and for sharing the testimonies of your family. I'm sure all of us have found them incredibly insightful, but also very, very moving indeed. So thank you very much, all of you, and thanks everyone for tuning in.